The tactical radio crackles at 0419 in the desert south of the Persian Gulf. A voice cut by static confirms it. Another night of strikes against Iran. A young American soldier tightens his chin strap inside an armored vehicle, his face lit green by the glow of a night vision scope. Outside the window, the desert stretches flat and colorless toward the horizon. 2,000 miles away, in a living room somewhere in the United States, an older man sits alone in the dark. Gray hair, a steady hand wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. The television casts blue light across a face marked by decades. He watches the same broadcast the soldier just heard on his radio. He doesn't need the details. He already knows this silence, the one that settles right before the first shot. 50 years ago, it was a different radio, a different jungle, the same tightening in his chest. 2 wars, 5 decades apart. No obvious thread connecting them, until you understand what actually ties these 2 men together. This channel exists to tell the stories history books reduce to a single paragraph. And today, for the first time, we're telling 2 of them at once, side by side. If you want to understand what actually changes in a war and what never does, you're in the right place. Subscribe and never miss the story behind the official record. He never told his grandson what he carried out of that jungle. But when that transport plane lifts off the runway tonight, the old man is going to recognize every single second of what the boy is about to feel. To understand what connects these 2 men, you have to start with who they were before either war touched them. The older man was 19 when his draft notice arrived in the mail, folded into a plain envelope from the Selective Service System. He was working at a hardware store in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest decision of the week was which diner to eat lunch at on Sunday. He wasn't political. He didn't have strong opinions about Southeast Asia or communism or domino theories. He had a girlfriend he planned to marry, a mother who cried when he told her, and a father who shook his hand and said nothing at all, because there was nothing a father from his generation knew how to say. By the time he landed at a jungle airstrip in 1968, he had fired a rifle exactly 11 times in his life, all of them in basic training. Vietnam did not care about that. The jungle around him was dense, wet, and alive in ways nothing back home had prepared him for. Triple canopy trees blocked out the sun by mid-afternoon. The heat sat on his chest like a hand. Every trail could be mined. Every tree line could be watching. His unit moved on foot, day after day, hauling 80 pounds of gear through terrain that seemed to actively resist them. Mud that pulled at boots, vines that tore at skin, insects that never stopped. The young soldier grew up differently, but not as differently as you'd think. He enlisted, not drafted. That's one of the real changes between these 2 wars. Nobody forced him into a recruiting office. He walked in on his own, partly for the college money, partly because there was a photograph on his grandmother's mantel of a young man in uniform that nobody in the family talked about much. He didn't know the man in the photograph. He knew the silence around him. He deployed to the Middle East as American strikes against Iran entered a new phase of escalation, a conflict that had first ignited back in February of 2020IX and reignited through the summer with renewed intensity. His world is not jungle. It's flat, brutal, open desert where there's nowhere to hide from either the heat or the sight lines. His unit doesn't move on foot for days at a time. Drones scan the terrain ahead of them. Satellite links keep commanders informed in real time. His rifle has an optic his grandfather's generation never dreamed of. His radio doesn't crackle with the same static. It's digital, encrypted, instant. Neither man chose the strategic picture he was dropped into, but both were shaped by it all the same. In 1968, the war in Vietnam was already the longest conflict in American history to that point. A fight defined by an enemy that rarely showed itself in the open, by villages that could be friendly by day and hostile by night, by a home front growing more divided with every casualty report. The older man's command didn't measure progress in captured cities. They measured it in body counts and secured ground that was rarely secured for long. The young soldier's war looks different on a map, but the uncertainty at its center is not so far removed. The conflict he stepped into is still active as this video is being made. A running exchange of strikes and counterstrikes across a volatile stretch of the Middle East, with regional allies bracing for spillover and a diplomatic track that keeps opening and closing. He isn't fighting insurgents in a jungle. He's operating inside a conflict where the front line can shift with a single strike, where the next 24 hours are genuinely unknown even to the officers briefing him. On paper, these two men have almost nothing in common. Different enemies, different terrain, different technology, separated by 50 years of military evolution. But strip away the equipment and the geography, and you're left with the same basic equation. A young man, far from everything he knows, being asked to carry weight most of the country will never understand. What do you think actually determines whether a man carries that weight for the rest of his life? The war he fought or the country he came home to? That question sits at the center of everything that follows, because both of these men, separated by half a century, would learn the same hard lesson, that the fighting is only the first half of the war. What waits for them afterward, whether they're prepared for it or not, will shape them just as much as anything that happens on the ground. But here's where their stories actually begin to diverge, not in how they fought, but in what each generation was given to fight with, and what each generation was expected to carry alone. The older man's unit received their orders on a Tuesday morning that looked like every other morning in the field. Nobody could have told them what the coming days would cost. The young soldier's unit received theirs over a secure channel, watched in real time by officers thousands of miles away who could see the terrain better than the men standing on it, and still couldn't stop what was coming. 2 different wars, 2 different centuries almost, and the same quiet dread settling over both of them as the orders came down. The escalation for both of them didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small signs first, the kind you only recognize afterward looking back. For the older man, it started with the silence of the villages his unit passed through. Weeks earlier, children had run out to the road when American trucks came through, waving, sometimes asking for candy or cigarettes. Now the villages were empty by the time his column arrived, doors shut, livestock gone, an emptiness that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. His platoon sergeant, a career soldier on his second tour, started checking the tree line more often than he checked his map. Intelligence reports coming down from battalion described increased enemy troop movement in the area, but nobody above his pay grade seemed to know exactly where, or how many, or how soon. The not knowing was its own kind of weight. He learned to read his sergeant's face the way other men read weather. A tightened jaw meant something was coming, even before the radio said so. For the young soldier, escalation looked like satellite imagery and briefing slides instead of empty villages. But the underlying feeling was the same. What began as scattered, isolated exchanges back in February had, by summer, hardened into a running campaign. Waves of strikes, followed by retaliation, followed by more strikes, with regional neighbors increasingly caught in the crossfire. Ships had been struck in the waters nearby. Air defenses across the region stayed at a heightened posture around the clock. His unit's mission brief changed twice in 1 week, each version more urgent than the last. Officers who normally kept a calm, procedural tone started speaking faster, tighter, choosing their words with more care. He noticed it in small things. How often the base's alert siren was tested, how much longer the lines were at the chapel before deployment windows, how few jokes got made in the chow hall anymore. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from not being told the whole picture. Not because anyone is lying, but because nobody above you has the whole picture either. The older man's company commander held a map covered in grease pencil markings that changed daily, sometimes hourly, based on scattered radio reports and half-confirmed sightings. Decisions that would determine whether men lived or died that week were being made with information that was, at best, a rough approximation of reality on the ground. The gap between what command believed and what was actually waiting in the tree line is where so many of the war's hardest moments would eventually be born. The young soldier's command, by contrast, had access to a staggering amount of real-time information, thermal imagery, signals intelligence, drone feeds, streaming back to operation centers thousands of miles away. And yet, the fundamental uncertainty hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape. Better information did not mean better outcomes were guaranteed. It meant more people in more places now shared the burden of watching the danger arrive in real time, unable to stop it before it landed. Technology closed one gap and opened another, the gap between seeing a threat and being fast enough to answer it. Most of what you've been told about either of these wars at the official level tends to stop exactly where the human experience gets complicated. This channel exists to start precisely where those official summaries go quiet, in the space between the briefing slide and the man who has to live inside it. If that's the kind of story you come here for, subscribe, because we're not finished. Both men, in their own decades, were being handed the same unspoken instruction. Be ready, because it's coming, and no one above you can tell you exactly when. For the older man, the moment arrived on a morning patrol that started like every other one. His squad moved single file along a trail worn smooth by months of use, rifles low, eyes on the brush. The point man raised a fist, the signal to freeze. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Birds called overhead. Insects droned in the heat. And then the birds stopped. Every one of them, all at once, the way the jungle goes quiet right before something goes wrong. For the young soldier, the moment arrived over the radio at Oro 300. A forward operating base roughly 40 miles from his position had just taken incoming fire, the third such attack that week within the sector. His unit was placed on immediate alert, gear staged by the door, engines already running in the motor pool before the order to move had even finished being read. Nobody in that vehicle bay said much. There wasn't much left to say. Everyone there already understood, in the specific and particular way that only soldiers understand, that whatever came next was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be short. 50 years apart, in two different deserts of the human experience, one green, one the color of sand, both men were standing at the exact same threshold, and on the other side of it waited the part of the story that no training exercise, no simulation, and no briefing slide can ever fully prepare a man for. The first shot, in 1968, came from a tree line the point man had already passed. It caught the column from the flank, exactly where the map had shown open ground. Within seconds, the jungle that had been dead silent became a wall of noise. Automatic weapons fire from at least two directions. The distinct crack thump of a rocket-propelled grenade impacting somewhere behind the older man's position. He went down into the mud without deciding to, training taking over before conscious thought caught up. Beside him, a man he'd known for 4 months was shouting for a medic, one hand pressed against his own leg, blood already dark through his fingers. There was no clean line between before and after. 1 second, the world was a patrol. The next, it was something else entirely. Something that would define the rest of his life, whether he wanted it to or not. In the desert, the breaking point came from the sky instead of a tree line. The forward base, 40 miles out, had absorbed the first wave, but the young soldier's convoy was still moving toward the sector when the radio call changed everything. A second target had been identified, closer, and it included the route they were on. The vehicle commander's voice, usually flat and procedural, cracked for just a moment before steadying again. Overhead, something streaked against the dark. Too fast to be a plane, too low to be anything but trouble. The young soldier felt the vehicle's engine surge as the driver broke formation, the world outside the small armored window tilting sideways as they moved. Would you have known in that half-second whether to trust your training or your instinct, knowing that one of them might be wrong? In the mud, the older man's ears rang so loudly he could barely hear his own sergeant shouting orders 3 feet away. He remembers the smell more clearly than the sound. Cordite, wet earth, something metallic underneath it that he wouldn't be able to name for years. His hands moved on their own, feeding a fresh magazine into his rifle, though he couldn't later recall doing it. Somewhere to his left, someone was calling in coordinates over the radio, voice climbing with each transmission. He fired at muzzle flashes he could barely see, at a tree line he could no longer fully trust, and understood, clearly for the first time, that the war he'd been told about in briefings back at the base was nothing like the one currently trying to kill him. In the vehicle, the young soldier felt the world compress into a handful of instruments. The gunner's voice calling out a heading, the dull orange glow of a targeting display, the specific, particular way his own breathing sounded too loud inside his helmet. The counterfire system engaged automatically before any human decision was even possible, a fact that struck him later as both reassuring and deeply unsettling, that the machine had reacted faster than he ever could have. When it was over, less than 90 seconds after it began, nobody in the vehicle spoke for a long moment. The silence afterward was its own kind of loud. Neither man had time to ask that question out loud. That's the thing training is supposed to solve for, and mostly does, until the moment arrives when even the best training runs out of answers, and all that's left is the man underneath it. For the older man, the ambush would go on to be one small, largely unrecorded moment in a war that produced thousands like it, not significant enough for a headline, not small enough to ever leave him. For the young soldier, the strike that missed his convoy by less than 400 meters would appear as a single line item in an operation summary, one incident among dozens logged that week in a conflict that, as of this recording, is still actively unfolding. Neither of them would tell this part of the story the same way twice, not because the facts changed, because some moments don't fit neatly into language, no matter how many times a man tries to explain them to someone who wasn't there. What happened in the minutes that followed, for both of them 5 decades apart, would ask more of these two soldiers than anything they had trained for, and neither one walked away from it the same man who walked in. What followed, for the older man, lasted 11 minutes. He would know that number for the rest of his life, because someone would eventually write it down in an after-action report, and he would read it decades later and feel almost nothing, because 11 minutes on paper and 11 minutes in that clearing were not the same unit of time at all. The enemy fire came from 3 sides now, not 2. His platoon had no clean lines of retreat. Behind them was more open ground, and open ground in that kind of fight was its own kind of death sentence. His squad leader took a hit to the shoulder and kept directing fire anyway, blood soaking through his uniform, voice never once cracking. The older man would spend years trying to explain that moment to people who hadn't been there. How a man could be shot and simply keep functioning, keep leading, because the alternative was letting every other man in that clearing die. Nobody who hadn't lived it ever fully understood. He fired until his weapon overheated. He fired blind through smoke that had turned the afternoon the color of dusk. At some point, he could never say exactly when, the man beside him stopped answering when he called his name. He would carry that silence longer than he carried almost anything else from that war. Not the noise, the silence that came after he stopped calling and started dragging. But here's what the official report never captured. In the middle of that clearing, with rounds cutting the grass around him, he made a decision that no training manual ever prepared him for. He crawled 20 meters into open ground, fully exposed, to reach a man who might already be dead, because leaving him there, even the possibility of leaving him there, was a weight he understood he could not carry for the rest of his life. He got him back, barely, but he got him back. Half a world and half a century away, the young soldier's ordeal did not look like a clearing surrounded on three sides. It looked like a control room bathed in the blue light of monitors, alarms rotating through different tones depending on the level of threat, a chorus of voices calling out numbers and coordinates and headings that blurred together into something that stopped sounding like language and started sounding like pure adrenaline given a voice. His base had absorbed the first two waves of the counter-strike. The third was already inbound. He was not carrying a wounded man through open ground. He was watching on a screen as a friendly convoy took a direct hit roughly 6 kilometers from his position. Watching men he knew by name, not by sight, disappear from a tracking display that had shown their icon blinking green 60 seconds earlier and now showed nothing at all. There is a particular kind of helplessness in watching a screen instead of a body, in knowing exactly what has happened to someone without being able to do a single physical thing about it. He would learn, in the hours that followed, that this kind of helplessness has its own name, its own weight, and its own way of settling permanently into a man's chest. There is no manual for which version of helplessness costs a man more. The one where his hands are covered in someone else's blood, or the one where his hands never touch anything at all. Both men would spend years finding out. Radio traffic that night described casualties, evacuation routes, air support inbound from 2 directions. The young soldier spent the next 6 hours running logistics for a rescue operation he was not physically part of, coordinating fuel and routes and clearances for aircraft he would never see, for men he would never meet, whose survival depended in part on decisions he made from behind a desk 300 miles from the explosion. When it was finally over, when the last aircraft reported wheels down and the sector went quiet, he sat alone in the corridor outside the operations center and did not move for almost 20 minutes. Somewhere in that same clearing in 1968, before the fire finally lifted, the older man remembers a stretch of maybe 90 seconds where he genuinely believed none of them were walking out. Not dramatically, not as a thought with words attached to it. Just a flat, clear certainty. The kind that arrives without emotion because there isn't room left for emotion. He has never told anyone that exact detail. Not his wife, not his children, not the men he served with, who likely carried a version of the same certainty and never said it out loud either. The young soldier, in his own control room decades later, would come to understand a quieter version of that same certainty. The moment the convoy's icon went dark on the screen and stayed dark for 11 full seconds before a secondary channel confirmed survivors. 11 seconds. He would remember that number too, the way the older man remembered his 11 minutes. 2 different measurements of the exact same kind of dread. 2 men, 2 wars, the exact same hour of their lives condensed into something that would follow them for the rest of it. One crawling through smoke to reach a friend, one watching a screen go dark and being unable to do anything but keep working. Different terrain, different tools, different distance between the danger and the man responding to it. But strip away the specifics, and what's left is identical. The particular, permanent weight of having been close enough to a war's worst hour to understand, for the rest of your life, exactly what it costs. That weight doesn't check anyone's calendar. It doesn't care whether the year is 1968 or 2026. It simply arrives and it stays, and it waits for the moment, often years later, when a man finally has to figure out what to do with it. What finally turned the older man's fight was not reinforcements arriving on foot. It was the sound, faint at first and then unmistakable, of rotor blades cutting through the smoke overhead. A gunship had been scrambled the moment the first contact report reached battalion, and it arrived low and fast, laying down suppressing fire along the tree line that had pinned his platoon for 11 minutes. The enemy fire that had felt endless thinned within seconds, then stopped almost entirely. He would later learn that air support like that wasn't guaranteed. It depended on weather, on availability, on a dozen variables no infantryman on the ground ever controlled. That day, it came. Other days, for other units, it didn't. The young soldier's turning point arrived differently, but the underlying mechanism was strikingly familiar. Help arriving from somewhere he couldn't see, made possible by systems he didn't fully understand and would never need to. A pair of fighter aircraft, redirected mid-flight from another tasking, reached the sector faster than anyone in the operations center had projected. Between the aircraft overhead and the automated counter-fire systems already engaged on the ground, the third wave of the attack was intercepted before it reached its target. He watched it happen on the same screen where, minutes earlier, he'd watched a convoy icon go dark. The same tool that had shown him the worst, now showing him the save. Would you trust a decision like that more, knowing a machine made part of it, or less? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and this channel isn't going to pretend it does. What's true is that the tools changed enormously across those 50 years. From a helicopter pilot making a split-second call by eye, to a networked system processing radar returns faster than any human reflex could manage. But the thing that didn't change is what both of these systems were ultimately protecting. Men on the ground, in the dark, who had run out of other options. In the after-action debrief back at the firebase, someone handed the older man a canteen of water and told him the gunship pilot had been flying for 6 straight hours before the call came in. He remembers thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes follows survival, that an entire chain of exhausted, anonymous people, mechanics, radio operators, a pilot he'd never meet, had aligned in exactly the right way to keep him and his platoon alive. Move any one of those people an hour earlier or later, and the outcome might have looked completely different. That fragility never fully left him. The older man never learned the name of the pilot who saved his platoon that afternoon. He tried, years later, through veteran networks and unit reunions, and never found him. It remained one of the strange, permanent gaps of his war. Gratitude with nowhere to go, owed to a stranger he never got to thank. The young soldier's situation was, in its own way, even stranger. Some of what protected his convoy that night wasn't a person making a decision at all. It was a system executing a set of parameters faster than any person could have. He found himself, in the days afterward, unsure exactly how to feel about that. Grateful, certainly, but also aware that gratitude usually wants a face to land on, and increasingly, in his war, there wasn't always one to find. What both of these moments reveal, sitting 50 years apart, is a simple and uncomfortable truth about American warfare across generations. Survival has always depended on something beyond the individual soldier's control. In 1968, it was a pilot willing to fly low into ground fire. In 2026, it's a network of sensors and algorithms operating at a speed no human nervous system can match. The tools evolve. The dependency on something bigger than yourself, arriving at exactly the right moment, does not. Both men walked away from their worst hour that day. Neither one would call it luck, not exactly, and neither one would call it entirely his own doing either. What comes next, for both of them, is the part of the story almost nobody outside the military ever really sees. The cost that gets tallied only after the shooting has already stopped. The older man's platoon lost 2 men that afternoon in the clearing and carried 3 more out on stretchers, one of whom would never walk without a limp again. Those numbers went into a report, filed at battalion, then archived somewhere he would never see. For the men who lived through it, the numbers meant something the paperwork never could. 2 empty spots at the next meal formation. 2 letters that had to be written home by an officer who barely knew how to begin them. 2 families, thousands of miles away, whose lives changed permanently on a Tuesday they wouldn't learn about for days. He came home 11 months later to an airport that felt like landing on a different planet. Nobody spat on him. That particular story, he'd learned decades later, was more myth than pattern for most returning soldiers. What actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, harder. Nobody asked. His mother hugged him and cried and never once brought up the 11 minutes in that clearing. His girlfriend, now his wife, learned early on which subjects to avoid at dinner. The country had moved on to other headlines while he was gone, and it expected him to move on too, on a timeline nobody had agreed to with him in advance. The young soldier's cost looked different on the surface. No empty bunks in his unit that particular week, the convoy's survivors accounted for, the mission ultimately logged as a successful interception. But cost in modern warfare doesn't only show up in casualty counts. It shows up in the 11 seconds a screen stayed dark. It shows up in the radio operator 2 consoles down who hasn't slept a full night since, replaying that same 11 seconds on a loop he can't turn off. It shows up in a base-wide debrief the next morning where officers used careful procedural language to describe what had, in plain human terms, been one of the worst nights of several young people's lives. He video-called his family 2 days later. His mother asked if he was safe. He said yes, because it was mostly true, and because the full answer would have taken longer than either of them had the words for. He didn't mention the screen, or the 11 seconds, or the corridor where he'd sat alone afterward for 20 minutes. Some things, it turns out, are just as hard to say over a crisp video connection in 2026 as they were over a static-filled long-distance line in 1968. The technology changed. The particular loneliness of trying to explain war to someone who wasn't there did not. There is a particular kind of institutional cost that neither man could see clearly at the time, and that only becomes visible with distance. For the older man, it was a Veterans Affairs system in the early 1970s that had no real framework yet for understanding what men were carrying home. No widely used vocabulary for it, no standard screening, often no real acknowledgement beyond a physical exam and a handshake. He was, in the most literal sense, sent to fight, and then handed back to a country that had not yet built the tools to receive him properly. For the young soldier, the institutional picture is more developed on paper. Screenings exist now, resources exist now, language exists now that simply didn't in 1968. But existing on paper and actually reaching a 23-year-old 3 weeks after the worst night of his life are two very different things. Systems built for a slower era of communication and slower deployment cycles are still catching up to a war that updates by the hour and never fully pauses long enough for anyone to properly process what just happened before the next alert sounds. Both men, in their own decades, would go on to function. They would hold jobs, build families, show up for birthdays and holidays and everyday obligations, and mostly seem, from the outside, entirely fine. That is, in fact, one of the most persistent and least discussed truths about what combat costs a person. That the cost rarely announces itself. It doesn't usually show up as a breakdown in a grocery store aisle. More often, it shows up as a slightly longer pause before answering a simple question, a particular quiet during fireworks, a refusal, gentle but absolute, to ever fully explain what a specific number of minutes or seconds had actually felt like from the inside. That quiet, inherited in its own way across 2 generations who never fought the same war but carried remarkably similar weight, is where this story is finally headed. The older man is in his 70s now. He still doesn't talk about the 11 minutes. Not really. Not in any way that would satisfy someone looking for a full account. What he'll tell you, if you ask him gently enough, is smaller than that. A smell that still catches him off guard sometimes. A particular quality of silence he can't hear without his shoulders tensing. A name he says quietly to himself on certain mornings and to no one else. He built a life, a career, a marriage that lasted, children who grew up mostly unaware of what their father carried beneath the version of him they knew. That's not failure. That's what it looks like when a man survives something and keeps going anyway, one ordinary day after another. The young soldier is still active duty, still young enough that most of what this war will eventually cost him hasn't fully arrived yet. He doesn't know, not really, which version of himself he'll be in 30 years, whether the 11 seconds on that screen will fade into an old story he tells rarely, or whether it will become something quieter and heavier that he carries the way the older man carries his own war. Nobody can tell him in advance. That's the part almost nobody talks about honestly, that combat doesn't hand a soldier the final shape of what it did to him. It hands him a beginning, and the rest gets written slowly, over years, sometimes over an entire lifetime. Sometimes, late at night, the older man still finds himself picturing a version of that clearing where the outcome went differently, where the gunship arrived 30 seconds later, where the man beside him never answered because there was no one left to answer. He doesn't share that with people. It isn't the kind of thing most conversations have room for. He simply carries it, folds it into the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday, and keeps going, the way men of his generation were taught to keep going, whether or not it was ever entirely healthy to do so. The young soldier hasn't had 30 years yet to learn what shape his own weight will eventually take. What he has right now is a screen that stayed dark for 11 seconds, and a corridor where he sat alone afterward, and a family on a video call who still don't fully know what those 11 seconds meant. Maybe, decades from now, someone will ask him about it the way this story is asking about the older man tonight. Maybe he'll have found by then the words the older man still hasn't. What connects these two men in the end isn't the jungle or the desert, the rifle or the drone, 1968 or 20 It's something smaller and far more durable. The specific private weight that settles into a person after they've been close enough to war's worst hour to understand exactly what it costs. That weight doesn't check a calendar. It doesn't care about the news cycle or which conflict is currently making headlines or how sophisticated the equipment has become since the last time. It simply arrives in its own time for whoever has earned it the hard way. And it asks quietly to be carried. 2 men, 2 wars, 5 decades apart. The same question, never fully answered, passed down without either of them meaning to pass it down at all. What do we actually owe the people we send to carry that weight for us? What you just watched happened, not to one man, to generations of them. The details change, the terrain, the equipment, the year on the calendar, the weight underneath it doesn't, the sleepless nights, the distance that grows between a soldier and the people who love him, the silence at the dinner table where a story used to be. That weight is real. It lives in real houses, in real families, in men and women who never found the words for what they carried home. If any part of this sounds familiar, if you're living it or watching someone you love live it, the description of this video has resources, real ones. You don't have to carry it alone.